doing? Good. Tonight, we are going to resume our study of the book of Exodus. And I just want to do a little housekeeping. If you have a question tonight, we're going to ask that you come to the microphone so that everyone can hear the question. And we'll appreciate everybody making the effort to do that. The second thing I want to say is that, time permitting, we'd like to leave 5 minutes or so at the end of Bible study so that if people have specific questions about the Ash Wednesday service that's coming up later on this month or about Lent, that we can address that. And the reason we want to do that is because we know that we are a Baptist church, and some of us have had experience with Ash Wednesday and Lent, and some of us have not. And some of us think it's okay, and some of us don't know what to think about it. And so this is a safe space. This is a place to ask some of those questions so that we can share and help to get people to understand why we've decided as a community to do this. Okay? All right, now let's turn in our Bibles to the book of Exodus. And we can go right on to the first slide because tonight we are looking at the plagues. All right, well, the second, all right, the first, fine. Okay, so we have 10 plagues. And last week we talked about the first and second one, water turning to blood and the presence of frogs, but I thought I would just list them all and where they are found. And you'll see if you look at where they are listed in the Bible that this is a fairly continuous narrative. We move from one plague to the next, so we start with water to blood, and then we go to frogs. And then I have here lice or vermin. One of the things that happens when we're looking at the plagues and doing the work of translation is we have to translate a word. You can imagine the word for lice or vermin doesn't appear a whole lot in the Bible. And so we know it's an insect, but there are debates among scholars as to exactly what kind of insect it was. So depending on your translation, you might get something other than what I have here. It's some kind of bug. And it was annoying. Those are two things we know for sure. The next one, insects. Many scholars believe these were stable flies, so they were blood-sucking flies, not just a nuisance, but the biting kind. So if any of you are from New England, they have black flies up there, and there's a period of time where you really don't want to be outside. So that's what we have with that fourth plague. And then some kind of pestilence that killed the livestock. And by this point in the narrative, it's killing the Egyptian livestock and not the Israelite livestock or the Hebrew livestock. And then to the next plague, we have boils on people, hailstorms, and this is not just hail, it's burning hail. And then locusts come, and then darkness for 3 days. And then finally the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn. So those are the 10 plagues as they appear in the narrative. And as you can see, it's a fairly straightforward narrative. Now, what you don't see from that list is the dynamic of how the narrative plays itself out. Moses goes to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh will say, Moses goes to Pharaoh, and Moses will say something like, "Thus says the Lord, God of Israel, let my people go." And Pharaoh has some kind of way of saying no. And then the plague comes. And then Pharaoh relents and says, just go pray to your God and make it go away and I'll let your people go. Except as soon as that happens, Pharaoh changes his mind. All right? And this is the dance that happens between Moses and Pharaoh. And so one of the questions that comes to the fore then is why there are 10 plagues. Why 10? Is that just because it's a good number? Why not 3? Why do we wait for 9 plagues for God to get to the 10th plague? And the other question is there some significance to that number? And so what I want you to understand is that the interplay between Moses and Pharaoh and the plagues is in all actuality a power play between the gods of Egypt and the God of Israel. All right, so we have this interaction between these two men, but these two men are representatives of the deities of these two nations. And so we want to think about the plagues as a part of how that contest, for lack of a better word, gets played out. All right? And before we move into the plagues, I want to remind you of something we read earlier on in Exodus chapter 7, verses 1 through 7. And this is what I call the plot summary. The Lord said to Moses, "See, I have made you like God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron shall be your prophet. You shall speak all that I command you, and your brother Aaron shall tell Pharaoh to let the Israelites go out of this land. But I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and I will multiply my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt." So that the hardening of Pharaoh's heart is connected to more signs and wonders from God. Okay? So think about the fact that if Pharaoh had just said, okay, the first time, when the water turned to blood, the Israelites would have been freed, and God would have been able to perform one sign. But here we are told, God said, I will multiply my signs and wonders. So it is God's intention to have a big show. All right? And that's one of the reasons. Okay. When Pharaoh does not listen to you, I will lay my hand upon Egypt and bring my people, the Israelites, company by company out of the land of Egypt by great acts of judgment. The Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring the Israelites out from among them. Moses and Aaron did so. They did just as the Lord commanded them. And then we hear Moses was 80 years old and Aaron 83 when they spoke to Pharaoh. But we know before the story or the action actually begins that God is going to multiply God's signs. And we want to circle back around and talk about why it matters or why it's important that God have more than one sign. Okay? But before we do that, let's talk a little bit about the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, because this is one of the things that's problematic in the narrative. God says, I will, hold off on this slide for 1 second for me. But God says, I will harden Pharaoh's heart. And there are times in the passage where it says, Pharaoh hardened his heart. So we have two different constructions in the English language, and they're really important because one says God's doing the hardening, and one says Pharaoh's doing the hardening. We don't have a problem with Pharaoh hardening his own heart. But what's wrong or what's problematic with God hardening Pharaoh's heart? Right. We all believe that God made us with free will. And so we're concerned then about Pharaoh's free will. We may not like Pharaoh, but we want to be equal opportunity employers, and Pharaoh should have free will if everybody else has free will. And what does it say about God if he doesn't? So before we go further, let's look at the words that get used to describe Pharaoh's hard heart. And there are three words. The first one is kaved, which literally means to be heavy. And it is not always a bad word. So it's a word that can have positive connotations or negative connotations. It's the same word that gets used to talk about God's glory. Okay? That God is heavy. Okay? God is weighty. That word is kaved. The same word can be used to describe bodily organs when they're not functioning properly. All right? So think about when you've had too much of the wrong food to eat and you get that heavy feeling. It's the sense in which your organs are almost heavy because they're not filled with life, if that helps. Okay? So then if Pharaoh's heart is hard, it's not functioning properly. And then the heart is the seat of emotions. It's also the place from which you, in this worldview, the place from which you would make decisions. Okay? So in English, when we say, in the English language, when we say something like, go with your gut, kind of go with your instincts, that's almost the Hebrew equivalent of go with your heart. This is kind of the center here. Okay? The second word, hazak, again, this is not necessarily a bad word. This is a good word. It's usually used as someone who is strong, or if you're told to strengthen yourself, hazak would be one of the words that would be used. So it can connote firmness or strength, but it can also connote stubbornness. And if you think about it, stubbornness is a kind of strength. It's a strength used for bad purposes, right? Right? You can make up your mind to be strong and follow God, and you can make up your mind to be strong and follow your own way. Okay, those are both forms of strength. So the usage of the word can go in one direction or another. Okay, the third slide, kasha, is the least used of the three. And this one means to be hard, but most of the other usages of this word tend to be more negative. So the first two that are used the most can be negative or positive. This one is the one that we see later on in the book of Exodus that's used to describe the Israelites as being stiff-necked. Okay? So we have three words used for the process of Pharaoh's heart being hardened, and we have incidences of God doing it and Pharaoh doing it. Okay? And we will return to that in just a second. Okay. Why don't we talk for a moment about how the process of hardening works in the story. So one of the questions that needs to be asked is, who is the agent of the hardening? And as I've already said, in the Exodus story, sometimes God does it and sometimes Pharaoh does it. But perhaps the next question, before we answer the first one, is what is the purpose of the hardening? So I'm going to give you two possible answers for what's happening in the story. The first one is something I know I've talked to you all about before, called an X plus Y formula. And an X plus Y formula is the way that, it's a way of prioritizing one piece of information over another. So in the Proverbs, we'll see something like, 3 things are wonderful to me, yea, 4 I cannot understand. And it's going to list the first 3 and then the 4th, but the whole purpose is to get to the 4th. And sometimes in wisdom literature, you'll see 3, yea, 4, and it only lists the one it wants you to know about. The other way you all know this is that sometimes you will see a formulation that says something like, there are six things God hates, yea, 7 are an abomination unto him. Right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, but you're waiting for number 7. That's the one where we lower the boom. So one way of thinking about the 10 plagues would be that the 10 plagues are an extended X plus Y formula, where you have X plus X plus X plus Y, and each one of these would be a set of 3. Okay? But that the purpose of the whole construction is to get to the final plague. Okay? All right, any questions about what I've said so far? We're good? All right, I'm always nervous when there are no questions. Okay. The other answer, which is a narrative answer and a theological answer, comes in the beginning, where God says that these things will happen, and we see this repeated throughout the narrative, so that he may know that I am the Lord. So here we have this verb, yada, which we translate to know. But this knowing is so much more than head knowledge. It's experience. So if you go back to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, when Eve takes the fruit, she takes the fruit not because she wants to know good and evil, but because she wants to experience good and evil. So that this term connotes what you know based on what you have experienced. Okay? So God wants Pharaoh to know him and to know him well. And that knowing is from having an experience. Okay? It's not a positive experience this time, but that's because of the way the entire scenario is set up. All right? And one of the things that you cannot undo when we talk about the story of the Exodus is the seriousness of what Pharaoh does at the beginning of the narrative when he makes the Israelites slaves. Okay? Because, and I think I mentioned this in the very first week, essentially when Pharaoh decides that an entire group of people are less than human, he has taken on the role of God. All right? God gets to name. God gets to designate, not humans. And the reason we need to take this seriously is less so because of our past and more because of our present. And ask ourselves today, in the year 2013, how we as Americans participate in systems that systematically make people other. When you do that, you are in dangerous territory. It's not your job to play God and decide that some people get to have a different or substandard living or housing. And remember that in the end, Pharaoh isn't the only person who gets punished. It's the people who are complicit in the system because they benefit from it. And this is really important because one of the things that happens is people who have had histories of being oppressed is that somehow we think we are exempt. Like we had our story. So we are then forever on the side of the oppressed. That's not true. Okay, as in fact, oppressed people are very good at oppressing other people. And so as we read this story, we want to be careful that we aren't always immediately identifying with Israel. Because there are days when we want to read this story and identify with the oppressors or with the Egyptians who just happened to be there at the time. Okay? It is never okay not to stand up for what is right. Okay? And so we want to keep that in mind because part of what happens is you get this focus. We get focused on Pharaoh and Moses and God of Israel and God of the Egyptians and forget about all the people who, for whatever reason, were either suffering in a system or benefiting from a system. And most of us, unfortunately, even though we'd like to identify with the Israelites today, probably have more in common with the Egyptians than we do with the Israelites. Okay, I'm going to leave that alone. So the narrative answer is that Pharaoh needs to experience God. And it is that he will know that I am. And then we talked about God's name, Yahweh, which we said means what? What is God's name? When God introduces God's self to Moses, what does God say his name means or what his name is? I am, that I am. What's another possibility? I will be what I will be, or I am what I will be what I am, that this concept of God always moving forward, which means that whatever it is that God is letting Pharaoh know about God's self is also constantly changing. That's why there has to be more than one experience. Because the gods of Egypt are plural, and there's a reason why the gods of Egypt are plural. Okay? It's not just the gods of Egypt that are plural, but the gods of every other nation would have been in a pantheon, right? Or a group of gods. So when we talk about the gods that the Israelites encountered through other nations, Baal, Asherah, Anat, all of these gods were in a group of gods. And they were in a group of gods because every god had a job, okay? And the name of the god corresponded to whatever it was the god did. Okay? So I need a god to make it rain. I need a God to produce the harvest. I need a God to keep me safe. I need a God to fill in the blank. I need a God for it. And the pantheon would then have gods for everyone's needs, and the name of the God would go to the function or the thing that the God did. All right? That means that this God is taking on more than one deity. Why must there be more than one plague? Because if there's one plague, then God has only bested one deity. All right? God's got a lot of people to deal with here. All right? And so part of what has to happen is there needs to be this repetition of signs. Can we look at the next slide now? So one of the things that we see in the Exodus narrative is this use of signs. Remember when Moses meets God on the mountain and Moses says, how do I know this is going to really work? And God says, here's a sign. We don't like the sign. If I were Moses, I wouldn't like the sign. The sign was, when you come back, then you're going to worship me on this mountain. But there are many references to signs and wonders. And so what happens in Exodus is that God wants to use signs as a way of making God's self known. And signs are not only used by Israel's God, but Egypt's gods have signs. That's why when Moses turns his staff into a snake, the magicians do it too. So that's Israel's God making a sign and Egypt's God saying, I got you. Okay? When the water turns to blood, what does the Bible say? The Egyptians' magicians could do the same thing. And so one of the other things we see is an escalation, that there are powers and signs associated with other deities. And so part of the reason that Pharaoh doesn't buy it after plague number 1 is that he's got a God who can do that. All right? So this God has to show himself mighty over a pantheon. And each one of the signs represents a particular power. So a sign is the way that a deity makes itself known. You could call it a signature. So that if I am in the ancient Near East and it rains, the rain is always the sign of one particular deity. That's the calling card of this deity. All right? The River Nile, I know who that is. What God is doing, the God of Israel is doing, is putting his stamp on everything. And that's something that would have been unheard of in that time. All right? And I can imagine that every time something happened, the Egyptians were running back and saying, well, who is this God? All right, well, that was the God of locusts. Well, who is the God of hail? And Israel keeps coming back with the same answer. One God. All right? This one God with many jobs. So this is God's signature, or we could call it God's calling card. All right? So you could say Yahweh was here again and again and again. This is not only formative for Egypt, it is formative for Israel. The signs don't just show Pharaoh who's who. The signs are teaching Israel that the God who is calling them can take care of them. Okay? That this God is the only God they need. And I need you to understand how countercultural that would have been. There's just nothing in the existing context or in the existing worldview that says you only need one God. All right? You have one God, you're not going to go very far. You have a pantheon of gods, you've got something to work with. So that this act of plagues is an act that is training, educating, forming the people who are going to become God's people. They have to understand that this God is going to take care of everything they need. And understand that once they get into the wilderness, every time there is a problem, people are going to doubt. Because they are not wired to believe that one God can do it all. Okay? And we want to stay with this for a second because the reality is we're not that different from the Israelites. It really is hard to believe sometimes that God can or will take care of everything. And so what we tend to do is decide what things we're going to let God deal with, right? We kind of divvy it up and say, look, God, I got this, you take this, and, we'll let the rest of the chips fall where they may. And so often, I think it is just because it is hard for us to get our heads around the reality that God really can do it all. Because there is very little in our reality that suggests, or there's nobody else that can do what God can do. And so there's nothing else in our experience to form us so that we can receive that and live into it fully. So we're not that different from the Israelites as they struggle to come to terms with who this God is, which is why it is important, as we see later on, that Israel and we get in the habit of telling the story. Okay, but before we do that, I want to say something else about what the signs do, because the signs direct us to how the God of Israel has control over the elements, right? God has control over the water. God has control over the insects and the reptiles and the livestock and what comes out of the sky and human life itself. So that all of that reference to the things or elements of creation take us to this concept of creation versus chaos. So now we want to go back to Genesis chapter 1. And in Genesis 1 it says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and I know I've got some Bible reading people in here. And what is the next part? The earth was formless and void. And those words, formless and void, come to us as tohu vabohu. It suggests that whatever it was that the world was, it was a mess. And the image that comes to mind is chaos. That God in Genesis 1 creates an ordered universe out of chaos. And when God orders the earth, God establishes limits, puts everything in its place. Everything knows how it's supposed to behave, all right? The sea knows you go this far, you don't stop. The birds know what they're supposed to do. Everybody's got their working orders. Then God creates us. And God gives us our orders. And our very presence and our ability to make decisions and choices brings with it the potential for disobedience. And disobedience has the potential of reintroducing the chaos that was put to order when God created the earth. Sin has ramifications. And we often think of sin's ramifications as how it affects me personally. But consider for a moment that our sin has other consequences. Consider for a moment that our abuse of the environment has consequences for people who are not yet born. Okay? That my refusal to do the things I know I'm supposed to do to take care of the planet, when I am carelessly wasteful, all right? So when we think about that kind of sin, or you think about institutional sin or corporate sin, think now about the chaos that gets reintroduced into the creative order because of sin. So can we see the next slide now? When Pharaoh oppresses the Israelites and says that human beings created by God are not human beings, Pharaoh is introducing chaos into God's created order. And so the plagues that come are signs that remind us of the battle between chaos and order. Okay? So we've got several things going on with these plagues. We have signs so that Pharaoh will know. We have signs so that Israel can be formed to being the people of God. We have the big showdown between the God of Israel and all the gods of Egypt. But behind all of that is a repeat of the epic battle between chaos and order. Okay? When we sin and thereby introduce chaos into the world, God comes in to reestablish order. Okay? But all of these elements remind us of that old battle. Okay. Let's look at the next slide, which is theological implications of hardening of the heart. Okay, before I go any further, any more questions? Are we doing good? Nothing. Okay. Free will. Does Pharaoh have control over his decisions, or does God? If we read the text literally, it appears as though sometimes Pharaoh does it and sometimes God does it. What does that mean? I'll give you a couple of possibilities. One I gave you last week when I said, I think it's important to read the text around God hardening Pharaoh's heart within the broader context of a battle between gods. That this is not God the Creator doing something to one of God's created beings or robbing a creative being of free will, but that it is more of Pharaoh making himself like a god and then placing himself in a situation where God says, if you want to play with the big boys, then we're going to play with the big boys. And then as a sign that he is the true God, then manipulates Pharaoh. Okay? So that is one possibility. Another possibility is that is one of language. So that we have these terms like harden his heart, that some translations will translate like, and Pharaoh was stubborn. So that is it a literary device that is equivalent to what we have later on in Exodus when it says the Israelites were stiff-necked? Or if you say someone's hard-headed. Okay? So that is another possibility. But I like more the one that places Pharaoh like a deity and you have these two deities fighting against each other. If God is hardening Pharaoh's heart, what kind of God do we have? And from the perspective of the Exodus, God is the most powerful God, the Almighty God who defeats the mighty Pharaoh. Remember, in the early chapters of the Exodus, who has the power over people's life and death? The Pharaoh. Pharaoh issues the edict that the baby boys are going to die. Pharaoh decides which humans are more human than others. Pharaoh instructs the midwives to kill the children, and when that doesn't work, he sends another law out. Pharaoh is the one who tells Moses that he must die because he has killed an Egyptian. Pharaoh is the one who makes all of these decisions. And so in this listing of plagues, we see over and over and over again God being presented as the one who can defeat the mighty Pharaoh. Okay? Questions about any of that? Okay, keep going. Now we move through the first 9 plagues and go to the 10th plague. But before we read the 10th plague, I want to take you back to Exodus 4, verse 22. God says to Moses, when he calls Moses, "Then you shall say to Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, Israel is my firstborn son. I said to you, let my son go that he may worship me, but you refused to let him go. Now I will kill your firstborn son. And this passage is in that really strange place because it's at the end of God's call to Moses, and right before that whole thing happens with Zipporah and the attack. And so it's in a very interesting place. But what is clear here is that what Pharaoh does to God's children, God sees as an attack on his firstborn. Circle back around to what the implications are for those of us who find ourselves in the place of the Egyptians. When we oppress others, we are attacking God's firstborn. Okay? This is serious business. And it's not enough to simply claim God on our side because we have a history of oppression. At some point, we have to move forward and acknowledge the fact that many of us have benefited from what this country has to offer. Yes. And that as a result, we might find ourselves participating in systems that oppress others. And just because we don't know their names or see their faces does not mean that they don't matter to God. Okay? So before we get all excited about, go God, get Pharaoh, we need to just take a moment and step back and say, am I participating in a system like all those poor Egyptians did? Okay? So we need to be aware and have some level of accountability. Okay, so we know before the story starts that there's going to be a 10th plague, and we know what it's going to be. And so everything up until that point in this narrative is moving us to that. We get to the 9th plague, at the end of chapter 10. So the 9th plague is at the end of chapter 10. And then when we move into verse 11, we have the warning about the 10th plague. It hasn't happened yet. We just get the warning. And then we move to chapter 12. And this is fascinating because we have all these plagues. We're moving up to the 10th plague, the final plague, the one we've known all along is coming. We get a preview of what's going to happen in chapter 11. And then in verse 12, God gives instructions for the Passover. Okay? Passover hasn't happened yet. But God wants everyone to know about a celebration that's going to commemorate what God hasn't done yet. Okay? So God says, okay, I'm about to do something, and before I do it, let me tell you how you're going to remember it. Okay? It's like, we have nothing to remember yet, God. That's not how it works. So the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, this month shall mark for you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year for you. Tell the whole congregation of Israel that on the 10th of this month, they are to take a lamb for each family, a lamb for each household. And then we have the instruction for a lamb, a good lamb without blemish. You don't offer up to God your leftovers. And the preparation for this, the sacrifice, what's going to happen with the blood. Go down to verse 14. This day shall be a day of remembrance for you. You shall celebrate it as a festival to the Lord. Throughout your generations, you shall observe it as a perpetual ordinance. 7 days you'll eat unleavened bread. On the first day, you remove the leaven from your houses. Whoever eats leavened bread from the first day till the 7th day shall be cut off from Israel. And we get all of these instructions between verses 14 and verse 20. And then Moses gives the instructions again to all of the elders of Israel and tells them what to do. And go down to verse 26. And when your children ask you, what do you mean by this observance? You shall say, it is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord, for he passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt when he struck down the Egyptians, but spared our houses. And the people bowed down and worshiped. The Israelites went and did just as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron. So here we have the anticipation of what God's going to do, the instruction for what Israel's supposed to do when God does what God's going to do, and then the institution of a celebration commemorating what God has not yet done and how we are going to tell our children. And the remembering of the event is as important as the event. Because if I don't remember what God has done, I can't incorporate it into my life. God did it, but if I don't tell it, if I don't live into it, then the power of what God has done is not allowed to make itself known in my life. And so what we have here is the significance of remembering what God does. And not just remembering for yourself, but telling the next generation. And that remembering centers us and grounds us and reorients us. No matter how successful I become, if I am a Jew, every year I have to say, remember, we were slaves in Egypt. Every year, there's a time where I remember what God brought me from. And some of us do this with our testimonies. So that some folks, when they give a testimony, stand up and say, remember, I want to remember for you and for me what God has done. And this is the power of remembering, not just for ourselves, but for future generations. And we've talked about this a lot during Black History Month and why it's important to remember not just for ourselves, but so that our children know. As a teacher, it's just such a pet peeve of mine, you know, to have to see students that come in late or have a bad attitude, and I give them a little speech and I remind them that their ancestors risked their lives to learn how to read. Do not come in my classroom and slump down in the chair. Honor that memory. And similarly, Israel in this event is forever marked by the saving work of God. God passed over us. God not only passed over us and spared us, but God literally redeemed us. God paid, there was a price paid for our freedom. So this act that is central to Israelite identity, to Jewish identity, is also foundational in the Christian faith, because it is the act of redemption. A sacrifice is made, a sacrifice of blood, that allows us to be redeemed or set free. Okay? One of the things that next week, next Wednesday, is Ash Wednesday, which is the first day, the beginning of the Lenten season. And one of the things that happens in many church traditions over the period of Lent, is people read the book of Exodus. Because the story of God's redemption of God's people, this story is foundational for who we understand ourselves to be in God. We are a people who were bought with a price. Okay? And we don't ever want to forget that. Okay? Questions about anything I've said? All right. So we have the institution of the Passover, and then in 1229, finally, the 10th plague, at midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne to the firstborn of the prisoner who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the livestock. Pharaoh arose in the night, he and all his officials and all the Egyptians, and there was a loud cry in Egypt, for there was not a house without someone dead. Then he summoned Moses and Aaron in the night and said, "Rise up, go away from my people, both you and the Israelites. Go worship the Lord as you said. Take your flocks and your herds as you said, and be gone, and bring a blessing on me too." So in this final moment, or at least temporarily, Pharaoh acknowledges and recognizes that the God of Israel is God. And it is only because he is humbled in this way. And then the Egyptians, in the following verses, encourage the people to go quickly, and they give them things. And remember, God promised that when the Israelites left, they would leave with gifts, and those gifts will come back into the story as we move along. And then we see in verse 37 of chapter 12, they journeyed from Ramses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot besides children. Remember, in the Bible, usually when they give a count, they are only counting men, and not all men of a certain age. Usually young adult men to men who could still fight, I guess is the way I want to say it. So men who were seniors would not have been counted. Young boys would not have been counted. Women and girls would not have been counted. So that means there were a lot more people. Then look at 38. A mixed crowd also went up with them. And so here we have a lot of questions about who this mixed multitude was, but it clearly suggests that there were more than Israelites who left the land of Egypt during the Exodus. And so here's an opportunity to think about anyone who wants to follow the God of Israel at this time could have left. And I wonder how many Egyptians there were who were unhappy with the situation in Egypt. We just don't know. But what we have here is reference to this mixed multitude. And the mixed multitude, as we move through the wilderness narrative, is going to get mixed reviews. It's a mixed multitude. There will be mixed reviews. And so I don't know if we're going to have an opportunity to visit that again, but if we don't, suffice it to say, there's a mixed story about them. And then we have them coming out with the unleavened bread. And then in verse 40, the time that the Israelites had lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of 430 years, on that very day, all the companies of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. That was for the Lord a night of vigil to bring them out of the land of Egypt. That same night is a vigil to be kept for the Lord by all the Israelites throughout their generations. And then again, verses 43 to 51, we have instructions for the Passover that get repeated before they move to the Red Sea or the Sea of Reeds. And then in verse 13, festival of the unleavened bread, consecration of the firstborn. And then in verse 17 of chapter 13, we get reference to the pillars of cloud and fire, which we can return to next week. Okay. Now, I can stop here, and I can see if people have any questions about Ash Wednesday or the season of Lent, or I can see if people have questions about what we've looked at, or we can try to take another chapter. What would you all like to do? Or we could keep silence. Yes. Sure. Okay.
But some of their views espoused by the Pope,
Mm-hmm.
I don't agree with.
Okay.
I really don't agree.
Yeah.
So if I wanted to participate but didn't want the imposition of
Yeah.
would that be okay?
Absolutely. Can I say a little bit about, you said a lot. Can I unpack your question a little bit? Did you all hear her? Oh, see, I was going to make you go to the mic because I thought you were pretty loud. So I'm going to try to represent it, but from now on you have to go to the mic. Tell me your name. What's your name? Deidre said, she said, I know that Catholics are Christians, okay, but she was concerned that there were practices in the Catholic Church that people followed because of the direction of the Pope, and was concerned about the association, if I'm reading you correctly or hearing you correctly, the association of the practice of Ash Wednesday with the Pope, and wanted to know if you could attend the service without having ashes imposed on you. Okay, great question. So the first thing we all want to remember is that Catholic actually means Christian. So there is nothing, so that when there are some people who have a creed that say, I believe in the Holy Catholic Church, they're not talking about the Roman Catholic Church. They're talking about all Christians, all right? So remember, all Christians called themselves Catholic, because that's what Catholic means. And it's not until the Reformation that we have the Protestants that break free from, or break apart, I shouldn't say break free, break apart from the Roman Catholic Church. So we've got the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Western Roman Church, which is now the Roman Catholic Church, and the Protestant movement, which has various branches within it. And we, 2 years ago in Christian Life Institute, we had a great class on the Reformation, and when it comes again, I really want to recommend that you take it because it's fascinating. What I want to say about Ash Wednesday is that it's not a good idea to associate Ash Wednesday with the Pope, okay? The first thing you want to remember is that ashes go back to the Old Testament. Before there was a pope, there were ashes. And so these ashes were a sign of mourning. Remember in the Old Testament when someone mourns, what do? There are a couple things you can do. Sackcloth and ashes. So you would tear up your good clothes. I don't know why you tear up your good clothes. You tear up your good clothes, put on burlap, throw dirt all over yourself, and ashes. So the whole concept of putting ashes on is a sign of mourning. All right, that goes way back before there were even Christians. And so that element is something that is very old. The connection then with ashes on Ash Wednesday as the first day of Lent is simply a sign that we're entering into a season of fasting and praying in preparation for the Easter celebration. And so when the ashes are imposed, the person who puts those ashes on us says what? Remember that you are dust, and to dust you shall return. And so that is really, that's one of the, the Pope ain't in that, is what I want to say. So the short answer is, if you want to come and not have the ashes, you can do that, okay? But rest assured, if you do, you're not doing it because of any allegiance to the Pope. There's more. Now you got to come to the mic. I'm going to make you work now. Thank you.
Do you think the general public understands the distinction that you just made?
I think that there are many Protestants that participate in Ash Wednesday services. So Lutherans, Methodists, and Episcopalians, and some Presbyterians are all Protestants that will participate in Ash Wednesday services. Baptists, Pentecostals tend not to, but there's no reason why we can't. So it is really a matter of a decision that you could make as an individual, as a part of this church, to enter into an intentional time to focus on fasting and praying. Okay? Those were great questions, so thank you. Okay? Yes. Where'd the mic go? Thank you.
Yeah, in the macro sense of God having Pharaoh to deal with, I guess, with God dealing with the Egyptians and more or less freeing, the Israelites and Israel. There's something that still nags with me. Well, okay, let's punish Pharaoh, but why do we punish all of the Egyptian, all of the people?
Yeah, I wish I had a good answer for you. It bothers me too. The reality is that there are times when people encounter consequences because of decisions that leadership makes. And that's not something that I ever want to feel good about. In this narrative, essentially what's going on is you have a people, the Israelites, who have lived through the experience of being made other. So the Israelites know what it is to be oppressed. And oftentimes, people who are made other learn to interact with the world that way. All right, I'm just going to say this. So think about the experience of being people of color and being minorities as people of color, and how easily and how quickly those of us who have been categorized find ourselves using very similar language and categories to talk about other people. Yes? If you understand that, then you will understand that Israel is an underdog. And so the language that she uses to talk about Egypt is the language that oppressed people use to talk about the people who pressed them down. Yes. I'm in trouble now. Oh, I can't get out.
I've often thought that part of the problem in the black community is that we don't remember. We don't want to talk about it.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to talk about it. There's plenty of people in here right now that were active in civil rights movement.
Yeah.
We don't even talk about it.
Yeah.
And I think, did the Israelites, did they want to be assimilated with the Egyptians? Is that the difference? Because we wanted to be assimilated with our oppressors. We began to love our oppressor.
Yeah.
And maybe that's why we don't talk about it.
Yeah, okay, so here's, how many years ago? When I went, the first time I was on the African continent, I finally understood why I had been studying the Old Testament. I was in Africa, and it's like, this is the Old Testament. I mean, in so many ways, the culture, the rules, it was like, I felt like on some level I was trying to get home. And I do think, and one of my greatest sorrows is that we don't have something equivalent to a Passover. It is historical, it is liturgical, and it is religious. And Jews that aren't religious will go to a Seder. Right? They may not go to synagogue or temple for a year, but guess what? They're going to show up and do this little thing. And it breaks my heart that somehow there's not this kind of Afro-diaspora remembrance of what God did for us. And whether that would give us an identity that would help us figure out how to live in this place and still have and hold on to our identity with integrity. And I do think this is one of the things we're missing. The songs, everybody knows the songs, everybody knows the words, everybody has the same meal. So, I mean, well, maybe doesn't everybody have the same meal. But the point is there's enough consistency so that this entire community says, our identity is rooted in the fact that God set us free. And what's fascinating is our ancestors got that part of the story. So they came here, their oppressors exposed them to Christianity, many of them. There were some who were exposed to Christianity. There was Christianity on the African continent. Don't let anybody ever tell you anything different. But many of them were exposed to Christianity through their oppressors. And they were able to discern through that the God of the Exodus. They got that. And so it's like a double tragedy to me that we don't have the equivalent of a Seder. Because I think it would make a difference. That's a great question. That's a great question. We got 3 more minutes. Come on. That's right. That's right. Follow the directions. Walk together, children.
I just wanted to ask some questions. Could you kind of, okay, I'm sorry, about the Lent or something, because I've never had that experience.
What is your question?
About the Lent, how does all of that work?
How does Lent work, or how does Ash Wednesday work? Okay, so there's something called Christians, Protestants and Catholics, many Christians follow a church calendar. And that means that The church year, so we have a calendar that starts in January. The church has a calendar that starts in Advent. So remember we had a period of Advent before Christmas? So Advent is a season in the church calendar. And now, following a church calendar doesn't get you into heaven, and it doesn't give you any special privileges when you get there. Not following a church calendar will not keep you out of heaven. This is not something that is necessary for salvation. But it is a way that Christians in many parts of the world move through the year so that they set aside seasons. In the same way we have 4 seasons during our year, in the church calendar there are seasons of fasting and seasons of feasting. So Lent, think of it as a season of fasting because we are waiting for what? The birth of Jesus, right? And so in preparation for this good thing, we pull back and people fast in various or sundry ways. But in other words, you let go of some things so that you can focus on developing your spiritual life. Then comes the Christmas season, and then there's a season after that called Epiphany. And then we will have a Bible study on this, so that's not in the Bible. But anyway, and then there's a season called Lent, which is another season of fasting in preparation for the great celebration of Easter. Okay, so so when we talk about Lent, we're talking about the 40 days where people, that's why some people give something up. Now the thing about giving something up is you don't want to give something up just to give something up so you can be on the cool team. The idea is to give up something that enhances your own spirituality. Okay, and so I would encourage, and sometimes for some people, giving something up is less effective than taking something on. So that for some people during Lent, it's better to say, I'm going to pray an additional time every day, or it would be great, for some of us during Lent to say, I'm going to pray like a Muslim, all right? 5 times a day, whatever it is, but to take something on instead of, but the whole point is to enhance your spiritual walk, all right? And so sometimes you'll hear of communities or congregations that will do something together to fast, but there's no rule that says you have to do it a certain way.
So are we going to do something similar, or, what are we going to do?
Funny you should ask, because the church will have a Lenten devotional book, just like we had an Advent devotional book, so that we had a devotional book that was printed out so that folks who wanted to could have some devotions that helped them to think about preparing for the Easter season. And the Christian Life Institute has prepared a Lenten devotional that will be made available to you very soon, and that will give you an opportunity, if nothing else, just to follow those devotions and meditations in preparation for Easter. Okay? But Easter, in all seriousness, should be about more than the dresses and the flowers and the big, seriously, about the big meal. And so if we can find ways to spiritually prepare for that, that's where we want to be.
Thank you.
Okay? All right. Last call. Okay. Saints, let's close in prayer. Are you? Come on. While she's coming for her last question. So for next week, let's read chapters 13 through 20. I'm going to do my best to get to the 10 Commandments. Thank you. Get to the 10 Commandments if we can. What's your question?
What did you say the significance for the number 10 was?
Significance for?
For the number 10, the 10th plague.
The number 10? Well,
What is the meaning?
I didn't give a definite answer. I said one possibility was that X plus Y formula, the 3 plus 3 plus 3 plus 1.
Okay. But what does,
She's like,
what
I'm
does
not feeling
number
it.
10 mean?
Huh?
What does it mean?
The 10th plague?
I know what the 10th plague
What does the
was.
number 10 mean?
I know it means multiplication or to multiply, right? That's what I believe. But what are you saying that it meant? Not the X, Y, Z, but what are you saying your opinion is that it actually means?
What it actually means for me is that God had to show multiple signs to prove that God was God.
Okay.
And I think it could have been 10 and it could have been 13 or 7 or, I mean, I think it's just the number, it had to be it had to be multiple times so that God shows himself mighty.
Multiplication. I just want to make sure.
All right, thank you. All right, let's pray. I'm good? Come on. Lord, once again, we just want to say thank you because it is a privilege to be able to study. And we ask, God, that you will take all that we heard and bless it, Lord. We pray that no words that came out of my mouth will lead anyone astray, but that you will fix all that was said and that you will continue to open up your word to each and every heart, so that we can continue to grow and become the people of God, furthering your kingdom. We ask these things with grateful hearts because you are the God who has redeemed us and called us by name. Amen.